Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought today we would do another video talking about some pretty cool summer event vehicles that may come. These ones are more focused on the Second World War instead of more modern stuff, which is what we had a look at before, and that's because even though there's a ton of Second World War vehicles in the game, there's still a metric ton to add, and looking forward to them all as we go forward in War Thunder, and hopefully you guys do too. Let's get into them. The first vehicle is the Stug IV, or the Stug IV. This is kind of an interesting vehicle in War Thunder's history because of the fact that it was in the actual German kind of planned release tree, even back when Germany was added in ground. Ages ago, I don't know, 8-9 years ago at this point, and it still hasn't made it to the game. It's still just stuck in the doldrums. One of the last vehicles actually from that batch, which is stuck. Now we have the Elephant, you know, the B-26, and of course other things like the Churchill and A-75. So the Stug IV is one of those which is a little bit less known, but still pretty interesting. There was over 1,000 of them built, and it was very similar to the idea of the Panzer III or the Stug III conversion. So taking the chassis, building a superstructure on top of it, and obviously adding a gun too, meaning that it should be a little bit easier to maintain, also cheaper, and at the same time designed for different roles. So the Stug IV had access to a 75mm, it was the L48, which you should all know, and then had the 4-man crew in it as well. The Stug IVs and the Stug IIIs were incredibly powerful for the Germans, and were used a metric amount, especially on the Eastern Front, and showed how powerful they were in pretty much all different roles. They generally did pretty well, and hopefully at some point we can get the Stug IV in the game. The vehicle also has access to pretty much a 300 horsepower engine. It should be decently quick around the place and also have about 80mm of armor on the front. Will it give anything that different to Germany? Not really, you know, especially since the Stug IIIs and also the Jagdpanzers exist, but at the same time, it sits right now in a kind of War Thunder's history as the where is it vehicle, and it's time for that to become the here vehicle. The T-150, or the Object 150, or the KV-150, depending on who you want to ask, is one of the KVs which has never made it into the game. So kind of the same story as the Stug IV. We have all of these other KVs, you know, the KV-1, KV-2, you've also even got the KV-220, which could be seen as the brother to the T-150, but the T-150 just isn't around. Now, what's the difference between the T-150 or the KV-150 and the standard KV-1 that we see? The main difference is the armor. This vehicle, instead of having 75mm of armor, it was increased to 90mm of armor, because the Soviets were not happy with the 75mm in 1940. Even though the KV was one of the most armored tanks in the world, they wanted to increase it, and that's exactly what they did. They changed a few little things as well, such as some of the chassis components, and also, at the same time, they used a new engine, because the tank actually reached 50 tons in weight. They put in a V2 engine, which output had boosted to 700 horsepower, giving it a little bit more of a kick. There was a few issues, though, in standard USSR style. Guess what? The good old engine overheated when it was going over specific surfaces and also at specific speeds, meaning that it definitely had its problems. It also had access to the F-32 main gun, which of course is the 76mm, and was developed alongside one with an 85mm gun with a little bit more armor on it too. And that tank became the KV-220, which we all know from a long time in War Thunder. Now, when it comes to War Thunder itself, as we said, it does have a lot of KVs, but it doesn't have this one, and there's also a few others that it doesn't have too. So hopefully we can see this one added to the pile. We can't go anywhere without mentioning the Messerspit. The Messerspit being a fantastic, interesting vehicle, being a Spitfire Mark V-B, which was fitted with a Daimler-Benz DB605A engine. Basically, this is kind of people's wet dream of mixing two pieces of engineering together to try and create a super machine. And it all comes from the fact that the Spitfire Mark V-B accidentally landed on the Jersey Channel Island, which was controlled by the Germans at the time in the Second World War, on the 18th of November 1942. So after this accident from the pilots, it was taken to Rechlin in Germany, and also it was modified to see its flight performance and to understand where it kind of came from. So they changed a few things. First of all, the electrical system was changed to a 24-volt one instead of the 12-volt one that the British used. The Merlin 45 was then replaced with the Daimler-Benz DB605A engine, which was the main difference between them. And then they pretty much just tested it. They also removed the guns, though, but I'm sure we can go a little bit skew-whiff when it comes to that in War Thunder. But yeah, all of the original guns on the Mark V-B were removed. But basically, with this vehicle, it was tested and it was found to just be fantastic. It had much better visibility and handling than the Bf-109, especially on the ground, which was one of the biggest issues with the Bf-109. Landing it was one of the toughest things to do because basically you couldn't see the ground when you were trying to land. And then also, at the same time, the general flight characteristics of the Spitfire amazed the Germans and pretty much made it and gave them a kind of plan to push forward with, which they didn't really do anything with. But the vehicle itself is very interesting, and another one of those, which even though it doesn't have guns, we literally have event vehicles in the game which didn't exist. So I'm pretty confident this one could make it. A lot of other nations have got their donkey vehicles in the form of howitzers, so why not America? Let's get in the M109 for the Americans, and since the M109 has so many different variants, you could stick one in as an event vehicle, and then stick one in the tech tree if you wanted to. The M109 is one of the granddaddies of the modern howitzers, and it has a 155mm self-propelled howitzer on it. It has been used in so many conflicts and by so many different nations, it's completely crazy when you think about it. A lot of people point to the Paladin, which was one of the variants of the M109, but not the only one. There was plenty of other ones as well moving around the place. Depending on which one you look at, it has an insane effective range. It only has aluminium alloy to be able to keep it alive though, and its main armament being the 155mm carrying 28 rounds. This was actually changed though with later variants with still the 155mm but with a different caliber being the 39 instead of the 23. So giving it a little bit more oomph. The engine being of course a Detroit diesel, gotta love a Detroit diesel, giving it 14.5 horsepower per ton, and everything being modified over the years depending on which variant you looked at. There are plenty of different shells which this thing also fired and basically used by a bunch of different people and a bunch of different nations. My favorite one, the current operators of the M19A1 right now, is Djibouti. So Djibouti, of course, are still around. But so many different people and so many different nations still use this thing. Technically, you could put this in every single tech tree if you wanted to, and come up with some ridiculous reason to bring it up. Like the British used it at some point, the Germans of course used it, the Canadians also pretty well. I mean, every country that you can think of in the world has a connection to this vehicle. That's how widespread the M109 was, which is why it's kind of surprising we haven't had it in game yet. For some reason, I really enjoy the tribal class destroyers, and you may be thinking, oh, well, the Second World War ones we have in the game, you know, some of the first destroyers that were ever shown when it comes to War Thunder. And the answer is no, actually the earlier tribal classes. there were pretty much two different sets of tribals in a way, even more depending on if you want to do the whole sub-variant stuff. Naval can be a bit confusing, but this one is the tribal class destroyers from 1905, basically built between 05 and 08, so before the First World War. Now, during that period, we obviously had the dreadnoughts, we had these new age of naval vehicles, and the tribal classes were really no different either. Basically, these ones had 5 single-mounted 12-pounder guns on them, or they would have 2 BL4-inch L40 Mark 8s. With some torpedo tubes on top of it. One of the big things that these guys had was they actually had 2 or 3 shaft steam turbines, which put out a lot of power. Now, in game, these are probably not going to be that useful. Like, they're not something that's really going to actually blow anything away. But at the same time, there's something that I feel like should be presented and represented because of the simple fact that you have so many of them, and also we have a bunch of other vehicles which have come from that era. The tribal classes, along with many other destroyers, aren't really seen in War Thunder from those early years, and we've started to get some cruisers from the First World War, so hopefully we can get some of these too. There'd be a nice rank 2 premium for people, just kind of wander around and donk people on, and be as useful as many of the reserves, or even more, that we have in the game. One of the things Gaijin likes to do is add in worse versions of vehicles as event vehicles. We see this quite a lot when it comes to Germany, with their higher-tier aircraft, stuff like the MiG-23 for example. So why not continue that trend with a MiG-29UB? The MiG-29UB is a twin-seat training model. It has an infrared sensor mounted only, it doesn't have any radar either, so you'd kind of be limited on how you would be able to go around. The East Germans used them. They actually received 24 aircraft, but 4 of them were MiG-29UBs. And obviously these were used very well more recently, since in East Germany, once Germany became united, Germany inherited all these 24 aircraft in 1990 and then upgraded them to NATO compatibility. So that will obviously include the MiG-29UBs too. I kind of like the idea of having just a MiG-29 without radar capabilities, just to see where it would sit and how powerful a radar like that is for a vehicle. That is the end of the list of vehicles. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Millie Draper, Juan the Panda, Nick R. Kupila, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie B. Young, Peter Grayling, Jerry Provolt, Bareen, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, Derek R., and Lafouche for supporting the channel.